When I was a little kid, there were still trains that looked like this traveling around the country. And I can remember going to a train station with my family to get on a train. And as we were waiting for the train, looking up at pictures of trains high up on the wall, looking down over the waiting room. And I just fell in love with trains as a kid, and I love to ride them. And these days, Amtrak doesn't quite look the same. It's more utilitarian. People stop riding the trains like they used to, but the system is still operating. We still have a national rail passenger system. But as I'll show in this video, not all the states are the same. Some have very little service or no intercity passenger rail service at all, while other states, largely due to the states themselves helping subsidize intercity train travel with public funds, have a pretty extensive system. And every state could be better, but I want to show the best states in this video for intercity rail travel. And then in a companion video, I will go over the states that are doing the least in the way of intercity rail. And I just wanted to say in general that I think it's important to have more than two options when you're traveling, more than just flying or driving or taking a bus, which is using the same highway system as driving. It just should be a third way. And so that's why I think it's really important. It's something my wife and I are actually looking at when we're looking at different states that we might want to move to, is which states have something in the way of intercity train travel, because we don't want to be limited to just driving or flying. So I think it's an important thing, and I'm glad that they've maintained the system, and I want the system to become more extensive. I know that the United States is not as dense as Europe, which can support a more extensive train system just by the virtue of the fact that they have almost twice as many people, especially if you include the Russian part of Europe or the European part of Russia. But it's way denser than most American states. I think the only comparable state with the same density as Europe would be New Jersey, which is where we live. And New Jersey does have an extensive 200 plus station commuter rail system that goes throughout the state. So it's doing fine, but it'd be nice if the other states, which really some of them have a real skeleton service, can pick it up. But first, I'd like to deal with the positive and talk about the states that I think are doing the most to keep intercity rail travel going as a viable third option. So this is a map of the U.S., the lower 48 states, and the rail network that goes across the country. And you can see that there's some big areas where trains don't go. I'll talk about that more in the next video that I'm doing as part of this series. And this next map shows the same routes that we just looked at, but it shows how many times a week a lot of the train routes go. So if it's in blue, it only goes one way each day. So for example, if you look at the major east-west route that goes through Denver and Salt Lake City, it has one eastbound train and one westbound train per day. And when it's in thick, dark red, that's more than 5 trains a day. So you can see a lot of trains are in the Northeast, the New York area, up from Boston down to DC and over to Harrisburg. And there's a fair amount of trains that run between Milwaukee and Chicago, and between Sacramento and the Bay Area, and in Southern California from Santa Barbara on down, maybe San Luis Obispo down to San Diego. And if you can make out, there's one line, fairly light blue, that goes through Indianapolis and Cincinnati over to Washington, D.C., and that just runs 3 trains a week. So not all the lines have the same density of service. And then this shows where the trains do run. There's a fair amount of cities that the trains go through, and they only stop at the cities in the middle of the night in both directions. And that includes some larger cities, for example, Spokane, Washington, and Salt Lake City, the trains only arrive in the middle of the night. So that definitely affects ridership. As you go east, Lincoln, Nebraska is another place, Little Rock, Arkansas, Indianapolis, and Cincinnati. And Pittsburgh just barely has trains that are in a normal time of the day, but a couple of cross-country trains going in each direction go through during the middle of the night. And also Toledo and Cleveland, the trains only stop there in the middle of the night. So there's a lot of areas where the train stations sit pretty silent for the daytime. And then this next map shows that out of all the routes, there's 60 train routes across the country. About 2/3 of those are subsidized by the states that they run through, where the states have decided to help provide service. If they didn't, there would not be anywhere near as much train service in these states, but the states do decide to give money for trains. So you'll see it in California, which actually gives the most to Amtrak each year. Illinois, which gives the second highest amount. And then a lot of the states in the east do, but to varying amounts. So that's one of the criterion I use to show which states I think are doing the most to provide train service. It's a big factor. So this shows the states that I'm ranking the highest, and I'll talk about them more by region. And you can see there's a couple out west, and there's some in the Midwest, and then most of the states along the eastern seaboard from South Carolina up to Maine have a fair amount of service or help subsidize the service that they have. So they deserve props for doing that. So let's get the western states, and we'll start off with California, which is the #1 state for intercity train travel. And they have an extensive network. They have more than 70 stations. Only 4 of those are owned by Amtrak. They have more than twice the number of stations in the next highest state, which is Illinois. They subsidize to the tune of more than $100 million a year, $109 million in 2019. So they're by far and away the biggest subsidizer of Amtrak service. And that figures out to, according to my calculations, about $3,000 per train, which puts them in the middle of the pack. Some of the states, for example, Illinois spends the most per train. And I have had to calculate that statistic myself because the data is not readily available on the Amtrak website or any other website that I came across. There is one table that shows how much money in the most recent year was fiscal 2019, which is right before the pandemic, and it shows how much subsidies have gone to each train line. And so you have to deduce what states those trains are running in. So a lot of them are easy to recognize, but some of them, it's a case where 2 states might split the cost in some fashion. Maybe not 50-50, maybe 50-50, but maybe according to the number of stations in each state or the number of miles traveled or the number of passengers relative to each of the states. I don't know how they do it. The table I saw, I think it was on the Amtrak website, just shows the total amount given for a particular train by whatever states are serviced by that particular train route. And I'm thinking one example is Washington and Oregon split the cost of subsidizing the Cascade train in the Pacific Northwest, but I'm not sure if it's 50-50 or how it's actually broken down. So maybe if anybody has any knowledge, they could inform me, but that's just my calculation. So in California, they run the 3rd most number of trains per day, 103 trains per day, somewhere in the state. Most of them are subsidized. They have the 2nd most riders per year behind New York. And New York is really influenced by New York City, where New York City's ridership alone is almost equal to the whole state of California. So it just shows you how many people go through New York City. And in California, they had the 5th biggest drop in ridership since COVID, and Vermont lost the most from COVID. But California has the biggest population of any state in the U.S. It is the 2nd biggest land area of the lower 48 states. It's a little smaller than Sweden. I was comparing U.S. states to European countries just to give it a relative feel. So you don't think of Sweden as being one of the largest European countries. It has 3 to 4 times the number of stations as Texas. So Texas is a larger state, but California has way more stations. And it ranks right in the middle of the pack in terms of how many stations they have spread across the entire population of California. So those are just some of the statistics. This shows the different train routes. Most of them are subsidized by the state of California. Good for them. And some of the cross-country trains, for example, the Coast Starlight that goes all the way up to Portland and Seattle, or the Southwest Chief that goes from LA all the way to Chicago. Those trains are not subsidized, but the ones mostly from the Central Valley and along the coast are subsidized by the state. And these different maps I'll show for each of the states that are in the best states category. The maps come from the Amtrak website, and what's interesting about them is they show the congressional districts on the maps. So you'll see, like, where you see a number with a circle, like number 1 up in the northeastern part of California, that's a congressional district. And it's just to inform, like, if they want to have who you might lobby in Washington, D.C. for more funding for Amtrak. It's just one way to look at it. But the point of this video is mostly that the states themselves, I think, are critical. And it's not so much the congressional delegation that influences funding for a particular state. It's more the states themselves. And so that's something I will keep coming back to in this video and the next one about the states that do the least to support intercity train travel. So now I'm going to take you through some of the major stations in California. I'm not going to show all 70 plus, but I'll show some of the major ones. And the first one is Palm Springs, where this is a case where trains only arrive between midnight and 2 a.m. So the station sits silent during the day. Maybe that's a good time to arrive in Palm Springs where it gets pretty hot, but it's one of the stations. California has a lot of attractive stations. This LA Union Station, which I also featured in my other video of the best looking train stations in the country, and this definitely made my top. San Diego makes other people's top 10. I've never actually been to this station, but the pictures look nice. But a lot of the stations in California look nice. Santa Ana, which is also serviced by the suburban train system in California, as is Anaheim, spectacular looking station. Santa Barbara, very nice looking train station. Simi Valley. San Luis Obispo. Salinas, up near Monterey. The train doesn't actually go to Monterey. It's one of the few major cities that in California that the train doesn't go to. Monterey, Carmel, Santa Cruz area does not go to. There's talk about maybe reinstituting service to that area of the state. San Jose, Diridon Station, named after a former Santa Clara County supervisor, very influential in getting light rail to come to the Santa Clara Valley. So they named the train station after him, which was a nice move. Oakland's Jack London Square Station. The interior. Emeryville, which is a big place to board for trains from the Bay Area. Well, speaking of cities that a train doesn't go to, it doesn't go to San Francisco. I mean, you can switch to the BART or the Caltrans trains from Santa Clara Valley and go up to San Francisco, but Amtrak doesn't go to San Francisco. So if you want to catch a train to go, say, across the country, like I once did from the Bay Area, I think I got on at Emeryville. It's between Oakland and Berkeley, so it's a good place to embark on such a trip. And then Berkeley itself has a train station also served by the commuter rail in the Bay Area. Davis, which has UC Davis at it. It shows a good crowd there waiting for a train. They have a high ridership at Davis. Sacramento, also, it's in the top 20 busiest stations. I think it's around 15 of all the stations in the U.S. Good size ridership, another view of it. And then Truckee is way out in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Chico, Barstow is a very significant looking station. I don't know what their ridership is, but they really spent a fair amount when they built this station back in the day. They did with this station, San Bernardino, which I show several shots of in my other video of the best looking train stations in the US. I gave this a very high honorable mention. Fresno, Merced. So if you're from the different states I'm going to be showing, this is a way for you to see what a lot of the stations look like in your state. But this is the only state I'm not showing all the stations because there's just so many. Modesto, Stockton, and Lodi, or Lodi is the last station I'm showing for California. So let's move on to the next state, Washington. And this shows a train in the Everett station, very significant station building in Everett. So now I'm going to, when I take you through the different stations in all the states, I'm going to try to go along the different lines so that there's a certain order to the way I'm presenting. So as I mentioned earlier, Washington and Oregon split the cost, $22 million annually for 18 Cascade trains that run between Oregon and the Puget Sound area. And it figures out to $3,333 per train, which is slightly more than what California spends per train. So different states spend more than others. There's a decent sized range. They had the third biggest drop in riders during COVID, tied with Wisconsin. They're the second most populous state in the West after California, and they have really good service between Seattle and Portland. And one thing I'll mention tied to the next slide, which shows the same routes, is one of the things they'll point out. You can't quite see it in this slide, but Amtrak will point out quite pointedly that their service, their on-time performance is affected by the different private railroads that their trains run on. Amtrak doesn't own all the tracks in the country. They only own a small percentage, but they'll show how their on-time performance is affected by different private railroads. So I don't have a ranking of the private railroads, which ones affect on-time performance the most, but they're supposed to yield to passenger trains. But it's another case, I think, if you provided funding for more sidings so that trains would have a place to go, so there'd be like a passing lane so a passenger train could go by without having to be stuck behind a slower moving freight train. That's what it would take. And can't automatically just blame the freight railroads. They have a business to run too, and they have to meet the demands of their clients, their customers. So it just requires a greater investment in the infrastructure so that you can maximize the throughput of both passenger and freight on the different lines. So anyway, let's look at the stations in Washington, starting with Vancouver, which is right across the river from Portland. And we'll go up north, heading towards Seattle. This is the next station, Kelso Longview, and then Centralia, Lacey, which is the station right near Olympia, which is the state capital. And that's also a factor I considered when I was looking at the different states, is whether the trains run to the state capital. Most do, but some don't. Tacoma, and you can see the Tacoma Dome in the background. Tukwila. And so a fair amount of these stations also get Seattle Sounder commuter rail service too. So Tukwila is one of them. And then Seattle's King Street Station, which is also one of my top 10 stations in my other video. The interior, the King Street Station. Then further north, Edmonds, and then Everett, which I showed previously. There's a couple more angles of Everett, very significant looking structure. And we'll keep going north towards Canada, towards Vancouver, Canada. This is Stanwood, Mount Vernon. And then Bellingham is the northernmost station in the state of Washington. And the train keeps on going up to Vancouver, the Cascade train. Okay, so let's go back down to the southern end of the state. There's two east-west lines. So this is the southern one that runs along the Columbia River. This is right on the river, so people in northern Oregon can also use these stations. Bingen White Salmon, and a virtual carbon copy of the last station in Wishram. Very little towns. And then Pasco is a larger town the train goes to on the way to Spokane. But first we're going to show the other east-west line coming from the Seattle area. This is Leavenworth. We're going to be going east. Wenatchee, and I just thought this was kind of a funny sign. It shows you that Amtrak ranks 5th out of 6 travel options here behind these other ways to get around. So they're not top billing in Wenatchee. Ephrata, and then Spokane, where I mentioned before that trains only stop in the middle of the night. And I've changed the colors for this station because it's near where Washington State University is, as opposed to the University of Washington. And there's trains parked there, but they only stop there in the middle of the night. Maybe if you look out and they're running late, then they'll arrive there during daylight hours. And this just shows you, I'm not making this up. So there's 2 sets of trains. One goes to Seattle and one goes to Portland. So the one that goes to Seattle leaves at 2:49 in the morning. The one that goes to Portland leaves at 3:54 in the morning. And then if you're going east and you're coming from Portland, it arrives at 12:17 a.m. And if you're coming from Seattle, it arrives at 1:15 a.m. So all the action happens after midnight in Spokane. And this just shows you the comparison of the travel time between going from Spokane to Seattle. So on top of the trains leaving in the middle of the night, you're not going to get a lot of customers that want to show up for a train to do that. And then it takes twice as long as driving. And then the on-time performance isn't that great. It's only 59%. So there's a lot of things going against taking the train from Spokane to Seattle. This train is a train that comes all the way from Chicago. So it's more for people that are traveling for pleasure on vacation and they want to just see the country. So they're taking the train and they're going through places like North Dakota during the middle of the night, and then Montana during the day, but then Spokane in the middle of the night, and then they arrive at Seattle during the day. So it's not ideal. And if they had another train that ran during the day, I'm sure they'd get more ridership between Spokane and Seattle, even though there is a big time difference. But one you're driving and the other one you don't have to drive. So that's the trade-off. So I'll stop here with a review of the best states in the West for intercity train travel, and I'll pick it up in the next video covering states in the Midwest, and we'll see how it goes, whether it'll be 1 or 2 more videos showing the best states in the whole country. Thanks for watching.